There's a moment in naval warfare that every sailor trains for and hopes never actually happens. The moment when an adversary crosses from posturing into actually pulling the trigger on a live American warship. That moment happened in the Strait of Hormuz, when Iranian forces launched a coordinated barrage of missiles, drones, and small boats directly at 3 United States Navy destroyers as they transited one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the planet. And what came next happened fast. A defensive intercept, a counterstrike, and a public warning from CENTCOM that the United States does not seek escalation, but will absolutely protect its forces, no matter how the encounter looks in the moment it's unfolding. So let's walk through exactly what happened out on that water, how the Navy actually stopped every single incoming threat, what the response looked like on the ground in Iran within hours, and why this single encounter says so much about how this entire war has been fought from the very beginning. The 3 ships involved were not some lightly armed patrol boats caught off guard in open water. These were Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, USS Truxtun, USS Rafael Peralta, and USS Mason, some of the most capable surface combatants in the entire United States Navy, built specifically around the Aegis Combat System, a networked radar and missile defense architecture designed from the ground up to track and destroy exactly the kind of saturation attack Iran attempted that day. These 3 destroyers were transiting the strait, moving from the Persian Gulf out into the Gulf of Oman, a routine but always tense passage through a choke point that Iran had already spent months trying to turn into one of the most contested waterways on Earth, one that at its narrowest point squeezes down to roughly 33 kilometers of water separating Iranian territory from Oman, leaving very little room for any ship to maneuver away from a coordinated coastal threat, even under the best circumstances. As they moved through that narrow passage, Iranian forces launched what CENTCOM described as multiple missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and small boats, a combined arms attack designed to overwhelm a ship's defenses by throwing several different types of threats at it simultaneously, rather than relying on a single missile that a well-trained crew might pick off easily. This tactic is not new, and understanding it is actually key to understanding why the Navy's response was as fast and as clean as it turned out to be. Iran has spent years building what regional naval analysts often refer to as a mosquito fleet. Dozens, if not hundreds, of small, fast, heavily armed boats operated by the IRGC Navy, designed to swarm larger vessels from multiple directions at once, close enough to make missile intercepts more difficult and to force a defending ship to divide its attention across the surface, the air, and the subsurface all at the same time. Pair that swarm tactic with land-based anti-ship cruise missiles fired from hidden coastal batteries and drones launched to add even more clutter to the picture, and you get an attack designed to look chaotic and overwhelming on paper. On paper, it should have been genuinely dangerous. In practice, it wasn't, and that gap between the theory of the attack and the reality of what happened is exactly why this moment became such a significant story in this war. A senior U.S. official briefed on the engagement described the incoming fire as a mix of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, a combination that lines up closely with the same coastal missile network that has been the target of repeated American strikes throughout this war. The cruise missile component almost certainly drew on the same family of sea-skimming, radar-evading anti-ship missiles Iran has spent years dispersing along its coastline, specifically for a scenario like this one, weapons designed to fly low enough over the water to buy themselves extra seconds before a defending ship's radar can lock on. Layering ballistic missiles on top of that cruise missile threat, and then adding drones and small boats into the same engagement window, was a deliberate attempt to force the destroyer's combat systems to prioritize across multiple threat types simultaneously, each with different flight profiles, different speeds, and different intercept solutions, rather than facing one clean, predictable threat at a time. That kind of layered, multi-type attack is exactly the scenario Aegis-equipped destroyers train against constantly, and the outcome here suggests that training translated directly into a real engagement. CENTCOM's own statement afterward was about as clear as military communications ever get. Iranian forces launched the attack as the 3 destroyers transited the strait, and every single incoming threat was intercepted. No American ship was hit. No American sailor was harmed. The statement specifically said that United States forces neutralized the approaching threats and then struck back, hitting Iranian military targets responsible for the attack, including missile and drone launch sites, command and control locations, and the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance nodes that had been used to coordinate the assault in the first place. That last detail matters more than it might seem at first glance, because hitting the ISR nodes means going after the eyes and ears Iran was using to actually see the American ships and time the attack in the first place, not just the launchers that fired the weapons. That is a deliberate choice, aimed at degrading Iran's ability to attempt something similar again in the near future, not just punishing the specific units that fired that day. President Trump's characterization of the engagement afterward was considerably more dramatic than the measured language coming out of CENTCOM, describing the Iranian attacking forces as completely destroyed, and the incoming projectiles as having been shot out of the sky entirely. Iran's own account of the encounter, unsurprisingly, told a very different story, and the gap between the two versions is itself worth noting as part of the record here. Iranian state media and the IRGC Navy claimed credit for the attack and asserted that American destroyers had actually been damaged during the exchange, a claim that stood in direct contradiction to CENTCOM's insistence that no American assets were harmed at all. This kind of dueling narrative, one side claiming a clean, total defensive success, and the other claiming real damage was inflicted, has honestly been a recurring feature of naval engagements throughout this war. And it reflects how difficult it can be to independently verify exactly what happened in the middle of open water, far from any camera crew, with both sides having every incentive to shape the story in their own favor for their own domestic and international audiences. What we do know with a higher degree of confidence comes from how the Navy actually pulled off a clean defensive result against a multi-domain attack like this, and it comes down to layers. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is built around the idea that no single defensive system should ever be the last line against an incoming threat. The Aegis Combat System uses powerful phased array radar to track dozens of targets simultaneously, feeding that data to a suite of interceptors that engage threats at different ranges. Standard missile interceptors handle threats at longer range, designed to take out cruise missiles or aircraft well before they get close enough to matter. Closer in, the Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, essentially a radar-guided rotary cannon capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute, exists specifically as the very last layer of defense against anything that slips past the missile intercept layer, a system built to shred an incoming missile or drone in the final seconds before impact. And for the small boat threat specifically, destroyers carry deck-mounted machine guns and coordinate with embarked helicopters and any nearby friendly aircraft to engage fast-moving surface targets before they can get close enough to do real damage. Layer all of that together, radar tracking dozens of contacts at once, long-range interceptors, close-in defense, and dedicated surface engagement capability, and you get exactly the kind of layered defense that was built specifically to survive an attack that looks a lot like what Iran attempted in the Strait that day, against exactly the class of ship most likely to face it. That evacuation effort, publicly referred to as Operation Project Freedom, had been running specifically to move roughly 23,000 stranded civilians from more than 80 different countries out of the Persian Gulf region. Ordinary people, oil and gas workers, families, contractors, caught in a region that had effectively become a war zone practically overnight once the strait closed and commercial shipping ground to a halt. Coordinating an evacuation of that scale requires exactly the kind of safe maritime and air corridors that an attack on American warships directly threatens, which is part of why Iran's decision to strike at this specific moment carried extra weight. It wasn't simply an attack on military assets in isolation. It was an attack that risked destabilizing a humanitarian logistics operation actively trying to get tens of thousands of foreign nationals safely out of harm's way. There is also a broader piece of context that explains why Iran chose this particular moment to escalate against American warships directly, rather than continuing to focus purely on commercial shipping and coastal harassment, which had been more the pattern up to that point. This attack happened during a period when the war was technically operating under a ceasefire framework that had been negotiated earlier in the conflict, a fragile arrangement that both sides had already been testing and probing at the edges for weeks. It also came during a period when the United States was actively running an operation aimed at evacuating tens of thousands of stranded civilians from dozens of countries out of the Persian Gulf region, a humanitarian logistics effort running in parallel with ongoing military operations. Firing directly at American warships during that kind of sensitive window was about as clear a signal as Iran could send that it was willing to test just how far it could push before provoking a serious response. And it did not take long to find out exactly how far that was. Within hours of the attack in the Strait, American aircraft were already striking targets deep inside Iranian territory. The response hit Qeshm Island and Bandar Abbas, the same coastal hub and underground missile complex that has come up again and again throughout this war as one of Iran's most important pieces of naval and coastal defense infrastructure. It also hit an Iranian naval facility at Minab, a location tied directly to the coastal forces responsible for operating exactly the kind of small boat swarm tactics used in the attack on the destroyers. According to officials briefed on the operation, the retaliatory strikes were also connected to a separate Iranian strike that had hit the United Arab Emirates and its oil hub at Fujairah around the same time, meaning the American response was addressing more than one provocation from the same short window, treating the attack on the warships and the strike on a regional partner's energy infrastructure as part of the same pattern of behavior, requiring a unified answer. Targets in that response specifically included Iranian drone launching sites, coastal radar installations, and the coastal anti-ship cruise missile batteries that make the strait so dangerous for shipping in the first place, exactly the kind of hidden, hardened infrastructure that has required repeated strikes throughout this entire war, because of how deeply and cleverly it has been dispersed along the coastline. Iran's own framing of events afterward followed a pattern that has held remarkably consistent throughout this conflict. Rather than simply describing its attack on the destroyers as an isolated retaliatory action, Iranian military officials characterized the broader exchange as the United States violating an existing ceasefire, claiming that American strikes on civilian areas, including Qeshm Island, had come in cooperation with unnamed regional countries, an accusation that conveniently repositioned Iran's own attack on American warships as a response to earlier American provocation, rather than as the opening move it actually was, according to CENTCOM's timeline. This kind of framing war, where each side works to establish itself as the party responding to aggression rather than the party initiating it, has been one of the more consistent features of how this conflict gets communicated publicly, and it makes independently establishing a clean, agreed-upon sequence of events genuinely difficult for anyone trying to follow this war from the outside. It's worth pausing here for a second, because if this kind of detailed, grounded breakdown of what actually happened out on the water is useful to you, that's exactly the kind of analysis worth subscribing for, and a quick, genuinely helps more people find breakdowns like this, instead of just the loudest, most exaggerated version of the story. Now, to really understand why this specific encounter mattered so much, you have to place it inside the broader arc of the naval war that had already been building for months by that point. The Strait of Hormuz crisis had been running since the earliest days of this conflict, when Iran responded to the opening American and Israeli strikes by effectively closing the strait altogether, warning that no ship connected to the United States, Israel, or their allies would be permitted safe passage. That closure triggered an immediate crisis in global energy markets, since roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and around a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas trade normally moves through that narrow channel. The United States responded in March with a dedicated aerial campaign aimed specifically at reopening the strait, targeting Iranian naval vessels, coastal defense systems, and drone operations up and down the coastline. That campaign included the assassination of the senior Iranian naval officer who had been overseeing the blockade operation, a strike aimed directly at disrupting the command structure behind Iran's maritime strategy rather than just its equipment. By April, with an earlier ceasefire brokered out of Islamabad having collapsed, the United States escalated further, imposing a full naval blockade on Iranian ports, an operation that ran for roughly 6 weeks, and according to American figures, cost Iran somewhere in the range of $500 million a day in lost oil revenue. CENTCOM reported intercepting somewhere around 85 vessels attempting to move Iranian oil during that stretch, seizing several outright, even as some ships managed to slip through the blockade despite the pressure. Iran, for its part, did not simply absorb that pressure quietly. It seized 2 cargo ships of its own in direct retaliation, adding hostage-style leverage to the economic standoff and making clear that the blockade, however effective on paper, was not going to go unanswered. By the time the attack on the 3 destroyers happened in early May, the overall toll of the Strait of Hormuz crisis had already grown significant. Independent tracking of the crisis documented at least 1 tugboat sunk, more than a dozen merchant ships damaged, with several of those damaged badly enough to be abandoned entirely, 2 merchant vessels captured outright, a dozen seafarers killed or reported missing, and a port worker killed along with 2 more wounded in a separate incident in Bahrain. Insurance markets responded exactly the way you would expect, driving war risk premiums for any vessel willing to attempt the transit up to levels that made many voyages barely worth the financial risk, which is part of why so many shipping companies simply suspended Gulf operations entirely rather than gamble on a waterway that had already produced this kind of casualty list. Against that backdrop, an attack on 3 American destroyers wasn't some isolated out-of-nowhere provocation. It was the latest escalation in a maritime confrontation that had already been building for months, with each side testing exactly how much pressure the other was willing to absorb before responding with overwhelming force. The Bahrain incident in particular, a port worker killed and 2 more wounded, underscored how this crisis had already spread well beyond ship-to-ship engagements and into the ordinary infrastructure that keeps Gulf commerce running day to day, the docks, the terminals, and the workers who load and unload the vessels, still willing to make the attempt. This kind of harassment did not start with this war either. For years before this conflict even began, IRGC Navy vessels had a long track record of testing American ships transiting the strait during peacetime, closing to dangerously short distances, sometimes as close as 50 yards, forcing American crews to fire warning shots or launch flares just to get IRGC boats to break off and create separation. Those earlier encounters, unsafe and unprofessional as American commanders repeatedly described them, never crossed into actually firing weapons at a U.S. vessel. What happened to Truxtun, Rafael Peralta, and Mason represented a different category entirely. A jump from years of provocative, close-quarters harassment into an actual weapons release, missiles and drones launched with the clear intent to strike, not just intimidate. That distinction, harassment versus attack, is exactly the line CENTCOM's leadership has spent years warning could eventually be crossed in these waters. And in May it was. there's also a piece of this story worth understanding from a purely tactical standpoint, because the way this specific engagement unfolded offers a pretty clear real-world test of a debate that has been running in naval circles for years now: the question of whether large, expensive, heavily defended surface combatants like the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers can actually survive in an environment as contested and cluttered as the Strait of Hormuz, where an adversary has spent decades building exactly the kind of layered coastal missile and swarm boat threat designed to overwhelm them. Critics of continuing to rely heavily on large surface combatants in contested choke points like this have long argued that the combination of cheap drones, mobile anti-ship cruise missiles, and swarming small boats represents exactly the kind of asymmetric threat that could eventually overwhelm even a well-defended destroyer through sheer volume and confusion, forcing a defending ship to make split-second prioritization decisions across too many simultaneous threats. What happened with Truxtun, Rafael Peralta, and Mason represents a genuine data point in that debate, a real combined attack in a real contested choke point against real American warships that ended with 0 American casualties and 0 American ships hit. But that doesn't settle the broader debate permanently, since a single successful defensive engagement doesn't prove a system is unbeatable under every possible future scenario, especially if an adversary keeps adapting and increasing the scale or sophistication of the next attempt. But it is a meaningful demonstration that, at least in this specific instance, the layered defense architecture built into these ships performed exactly the way it was designed to. Let's also talk about what this engagement meant for the broader trajectory of the war, because it did not happen in isolation, and it did not stay contained to just this one exchange. In direct response to the pattern of attacks around this period, including the strike on the destroyers and the parallel strike on Fujairah, the United States moved to reinforce its naval posture in the region rather than pull back. CENTCOM confirmed that the same 3 destroyers involved in the attack, having survived the engagement without damage, were repositioned into the Arabian Sea specifically to reinforce the ongoing blockade against Iran, a decision that sent its own message. Rather than treating the attack as a reason for caution or withdrawal, the Navy treated it as confirmation that its ships could operate and fight effectively in exactly the environment Iran had built to deny them, and use that confidence to actually increase pressure on Iran's economy rather than ease off. Market reactions to this stretch of the war are worth understanding too, because they show how closely global financial systems were tracking every twist in this conflict. Prediction markets and analysts tracking the odds of a full normalization of maritime traffic through the Strait saw those odds actually fall in the weeks following this engagement, dropping from around 77% favorable down into the low 60s, reflecting a real-time reassessment among traders and analysts that the path back to normal, unrestricted shipping through Hormuz had gotten longer and more uncertain rather than shorter, precisely because of engagements like this one demonstrating that direct attacks on American warships remained very much on the table even during periods that were nominally covered by a ceasefire. There's an important honesty check worth applying here too, the same kind that's worth applying to every claim coming out of this war from either side. Iran's Mosquito Fleet and coastal missile network genuinely represent one of the most sophisticated asymmetric naval threats built by any regional power in the world, developed specifically over decades, with the Strait of Hormuz in mind as the exact battlefield where it would eventually be used. The fact that this particular attack failed to inflict any damage on American ships does not mean that capability has been eliminated or even meaningfully degraded as a whole. Iran retained, by most intelligence assessments, circulating throughout this period, a substantial share of its coastal missile stockpile and mobile launcher fleet, even after months of American and Israeli strikes, and the Mosquito Fleet itself, built around large numbers of cheap, fast, hard-to-track small boats, is exactly the kind of dispersed capability that survives sustained bombing campaigns far better than fixed, large, easily identified targets. That means engagements like this one, however cleanly the American side came out of it, are unlikely to be the last attempt Iran makes at directly targeting an American naval vessel, especially as the broader war continues its now familiar cycle of strikes, retaliation, brief pauses, and renewed escalation. On top of the missile and swarm boat threat, Iran had also spent months laying sea mines throughout parts of the strait as part of its broader effort to make the waterway as costly and unpredictable as possible for any vessel attempting to transit it, a threat that operates completely differently from missiles or drones because it does not require any active launch or targeting decision in the moment. It simply sits and waits. Minesweeping operations to clear those threats have run in parallel with the strike campaigns throughout this war, adding yet another layer of danger that every ship moving through the strait, warship, or commercial tanker alike has had to account for on top of everything else. That cycle is really the through line connecting this single naval engagement to everything else that's happened in this war since it began back in February. Iran applies pressure, whether through closing the strait, striking commercial shipping, or directly attacking a warship, calculating that the economic and political cost of that pressure will eventually force some kind of concession. The The United States and its allies respond with overwhelming conventional force, hitting the specific infrastructure responsible for the provocation while explicitly stating, as CENTCOM did here, that escalation is not the goal, even while demonstrating an obvious willingness to escalate if pushed. And in the background, diplomatic channels keep working, sometimes producing brief ceasefires that hold for a matter of weeks before collapsing under the weight of exactly this kind of direct military confrontation. The attack on Truxtun, Rafael Peralta, and Mason fits that pattern perfectly. A moment when Iran tested the boundaries of an existing ceasefire in about as direct a way as possible, and found those boundaries enforced within hours through strikes on some of its most important coastal military infrastructure. Allied reaction to the engagement reinforced just how closely this war has been watched by nations with no direct role in the fighting. Gulf partners hosting American forces, along with European allies, tracking the safety of their own commercial shipping interests in the region, treated the attack as fresh confirmation that the Strait remained fundamentally unsafe for normal maritime traffic, regardless of whatever ceasefire framework happened to be nominally in place at the time. Maritime advisory services that track risk for commercial shippers issued fresh warnings in the days following the engagement, specifically flagging the demonstrated willingness of Iranian forces to target military vessels directly as a signal that commercial ships, despite carrying no weapons of their own, remained just as exposed to the same coastal missile and swarm boat threats that had just been thrown at 3 of the most heavily defended ships in the entire United States Navy. Looking at where this leaves the broader naval situation in the Strait, the reality is that engagements like this one are likely to keep happening in some form as long as the underlying dispute over control of Hormuz remains unresolved. Every American destroyer that transits that waterway does, so knowing it is operating inside the exact engagement envelope Iran spent decades building specifically to threaten vessels just like it. Every transit is, in a very real sense, a test of the layered defensive systems built into these ships. And so far, based on what's publicly known about this specific engagement, those systems have performed exactly as designed. But the deeper structural problem, the fact that Iran retains a dispersed, resilient, difficult to fully eliminate coastal and naval threat network along one of the most important waterways in the global economy, has not gone away, and it is not going to go away simply because one attack failed to inflict damage. That structural reality is exactly why the broader diplomatic effort to actually reopen and stabilize the Strait long-term matters so much more than any single tactical engagement, however dramatic that engagement might look in the moment. There is a reasonable case to be made that this engagement will end up being studied by naval planners for years, not because of its size, but because of how cleanly it tested a scenario that had mostly existed in war games and planning documents before this war made it real. Simulated exercises can approximate a saturation attack, but they cannot fully replicate the pressure of a live crew at night in a narrow strait, watching multiple genuine threats close simultaneously on their own ship with real consequences, riding on every intercept decision. The performance of the crews aboard Truxtun, Rafael Peralta, and Mason under those exact conditions is likely to shape doctrine and training scenarios for surface warfare officers well beyond this specific war, regardless of how the broader conflict with Iran eventually resolves. What makes this particular story worth returning to, beyond just the tactical details of missiles and interceptors, is what it reveals about the stakes every single sailor operating in that waterway carries with them on every transit. These are real crews, on real ships, moving through a choke point that has been actively weaponized by an adversary with real capability and a demonstrated willingness to use it. The fact that this specific attempt ended without American casualties is genuinely good news, and it reflects serious training, serious engineering, and serious split-second decision-making by the crews aboard those 3 destroyers. But it should not be mistaken for proof that the danger in that waterway has passed. If anything, an engagement like this one is a reminder of just how close to the edge this entire conflict continues to operate, with American warships and Iranian coastal forces sitting close enough to each other in waters narrow enough that a single decision on either side can turn a tense transit into an actual exchange of fire within minutes. So where does this leave things going forward? The pattern established by this engagement, provocation, rapid and effective defense, and a swift, targeted retaliatory strike has essentially become the template for how these moments keep playing out across this war, whether the target is a commercial tanker, a Gulf Allies airbase, or in this case, a trio of American destroyers themselves. Each time that pattern repeats, it reinforces 2 things simultaneously. That Iran remains willing to directly test American red lines, even at real risk to its own forces and infrastructure, and that the United States Navy's defensive systems, at least so far, have proven capable of handling exactly the kind of saturation attack Iran has spent years designing specifically to defeat them. Whether that balance holds as the war continues, or whether Iran eventually finds a combination of tactics capable of actually landing a hit on an American vessel, is one of the more consequential open questions hanging over the entire naval dimension of this conflict, and it's one worth watching closely every single time American ships make that same transit through the strait, again in the weeks ahead. If you want to stay on top of how this naval side of the war continues to develop, make sure you're subscribed, because these engagements in the strait have a way of shifting the entire trajectory of this conflict within a matter of hours. Drop a comment, letting us know what you think this says about the balance between Iran's coastal threat network and American naval defenses, and whether you think engagements like this one become more frequent or less frequent as this war grinds on. This is exactly the kind of moment that tends to get flattened into a single dramatic headline, when the reality underneath it involves layered radar systems, decades of asymmetric naval doctrine, and split-second decisions made by real crews under real pressure, which is why breakdowns like this one matter. And if this breakdown helped you actually understand what happened out on that water instead of just reacting to the competing claims from both sides, share it with someone else trying to make sense of this conflict. There's a lot more unfolding in these waters, and we'll be here covering it as the next chapter comes into view.